G'day.
And gents, we're all feeling pretty tired today.
Yeah,
What's he
this is
feeling
tired
like?
middle-aged.
Tired
Middle-aged
old
men
man.
edition. Tired
Yeah.
old men. We're not middle-aged tonight. We're just old.
We just skipped straight to the old, I think.
Yeah, so Lachlan, you had a full-on weekend by the sounds of it?
Yeah. Just lots of running around, and I think I mentioned to you, like one of the kids has sort of snagged chicken pox, which you don't hear about so often these days because everyone's sort of vaccinated. It doesn't seem to get around as much, but anyway, so we got one of ours with it. It's not too bad, but it's one of that, and a couple of trips to the doctor, and we're off with some kids' activity just for the community thing all day today. So it's been a big weekend. So I'll
Fair
be
enough. Have you had
ready to hang
people
up the
ask?
birds and hit the hay.
Have you had anyone ask to do a chickenpox party?
No.
Yeah. I remember when I
The
was at
old
school,
school.
people used to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
was a
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
I remember
Yeah.
one of my mates getting it, and my parents couldn't get me over there fast enough. I was like, just get them into it.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the kids across the road from us when we were growing up had it, and then Mum did the same thing. Took my sister and I across the road, and got us to get it. Problem was, my dad hadn't had chickenpox, and then he caught it at the same time as us, and he had a really
Got proper
rough
sick.
time.
Yeah,
Yeah, he's
Yeah.
wrecked.
I have
Absolutely
heard
wrecked.
it knocks around the grown-ups a bit if they haven't had it before.
Yeah, he did not have a good time.
Mm. How about you, Ruben? You feeling pretty flat too?
I don't think I've had it quite as hard as you boys, but yeah. Tomorrow's Monday, but I mean, it's supposed to feel like Friday already.
Yeah.
It's all right.
It's
We're going to
Friday. You
pull
know what? It
together.
feels like
We're going to bring the energy.
it feels like Friday, but without the hope of the weekend.
So good.
Wow. Yeah. No, it's been a big one. Yeah, I had a friend who I've known pass last night from his battle with COVID, and that sucked. I was pretty upset about that this morning, and the day's been pretty flat as a result of that. But had some good bits too. We put up Christmas decorations and Christmas trees and all that sort of stuff, and the house looks nice and decorative, much to particularly my daughter's delight. My kids both like it, but my daughter was just super excited, and she's so excited about Christmas that she even got out these Christmas plates. They're like porcelain Christmas plates that we found somewhere, and she used them for dinner and lunch and hand washed them every time to stay nice and clean. She's a funny kid. Yeah, she loves
That's
it.
cool.
So what's in your glass tonight, mate?
Well, I actually am dual wielding tonight. So I have the cup of Earl Grey tea in my vintage Andrew Denton's Breakfast Show mug back from the day. This mug is pretty old. And in my other hand, I have a glass of Japanese whiskey. So I'm going to do the tea first, and then I'll do the whiskey second.
Yeah.
How about you, Lachlan?
Mate, I'm similarly old manning tonight by I'm just having a coffee in my Mandalorian mug, of course.
It's a
I
little
don't
bit
know
more
if I'm
contemporary than Andrew Denton.
Yeah, a little bit. But I don't think I'll be partaking in the gins or scotch tonight. But I'll be happy with my coffee this time around. How about you, Rubes?
Oh, I've got a new one tonight. I'm trying a spiced rum called Baron Samedi.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know the one. I haven't tried it though.
Yeah.
How is it? It's
I've
cool
just sort of tried it now. I quite like it. It's got sort of hints of vanilla, which I wasn't expecting. I didn't really see what. I just thought I'd try because it was the only other one the shop had. But yeah, no, it's really good. Very smooth.
It's from Bacardi, right? I think.
Perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's quite
So-
sweet.
Hmm.
But no, I like it.
Interesting.
I'm not disappointed.
Well, very good.
Hmm.
I'm glad you're not.
I'm sort of working my way through some Captain Morgan at the moment, so I think when that one's gone, maybe I'll give that one a try, something different.
Hmm.
Very nice, very nice.
Mm.
Well, let's open our books and get into the second half of chapter 8 of the Republic.
Sure.
So,
Cool.
Well, last week we did.
actually, that's what I was about to say. Who's going to cover last week? Did you want to cover that, Ruben?
I can wing it.
All right. Yeah.
So they're going through. What are they going through? They're going through 5 different types of government. The idea being, we look at the government and then we see the type of individual that makes up the society that government governs over. Government. Sorry, I just had to say it 3 more times. We went through. Socrates calls his almighty and great and all wonderful government because he made it up aristocracy. And then he reckons below that is something called a timocracy, and then below that is an oligarchy. And we did the timocracy and the oligarchy last week. And in brief terms, the timocracy is kind of like a warrior Spartan type state, and the oligarchy is a state that's based around wealth. So the richer you are, the more powerful you are. And then this week, we're going to go into democracy and tyranny. But the way he's been structuring it is explaining how one state goes to the next, and then what that state is characterized by, and then what the type of person that makes up that kind of state is. And that's sort of the structure he's been using all along.
Yeah, good summary. So I recall starting to read this section of the book and thinking, at parts, wow, there's some things in here that sound very familiar. I'm really looking forward to diving into this a bit.
Well, that'd be interesting. Reading Oligarchy last week, I could see some real parallels to the way that society is structured today in terms of, we don't really have an aristocracy anymore as such, but it seems to be the people with the money and the businesses now that call the shots, more or less. So I was sort of thinking, you can see the oligarchy operating today. But then as I read this, I was like, oh, no. When he starts talking about democracy, I'm like, there's a lot of parallels there too.
Yeah, I just think it's really interesting as we're sort of getting in there too. And I thought the order that he called these out in was interesting from a start, because he's sort of saying from one basically progresses down the order to the worst option, right? And that democracy
he does present
it was like one step from the bottom, which is interesting.
Yeah, he presents it like a hierarchy, but we'll get into it in a minute. But when he finishes explaining democracy, there's a somewhat fond of it almost. Like he wouldn't say he speaks highly of it, but I think he gives it a fair shake.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was surprised that it was so low on his bar as well.
Well, especially since he's pretty scandalous of the oligarchy, and then he's going, well, this is one step worse than that,
I think when he describes what characterizes democracy, and when you compare that to what he says is justice, because it kind of, you can see why it's a little bit further down the list, but we'll kind of get into that. So how does it make the shift? How do we go from oligarchy to democracy?
It gives sort of a bit of I suppose, like another sort of recap on what oligarchy is, and just pointing out, I guess, the fact that it's just the object is to become as wealthy as possible in order to obtain the power. And he's just saying that the state will more or less start to run out of control, I guess, because the leaders won't try and rein this in, because it's in their very best interest to let it keep going, because they're profiting off of everybody else. So the spendthrift was the term they were using last week, about the person who'd just be blowing their cash. And so the leaders are making stacks of coin off them. So why are they going to try and rein the state in while they're making fat stacks? Um,
That's tax. Yeah, yeah. The wording in my book right at the start is a lack of restraint in the pursuit of his objective. Uh, so oligarchy results in a lack of restraint in the pursuit of its objective of getting
hmm.
as rich as possible. So there's no restraint in sort of going after the money.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, and I think they're saying that they'll ruin men and make beggars of them, like, and not give a damn because all that matters is like money is king, and if I've got to ruin you in order to get richer, then so be it. Um, so, and
yeah,
I
but
think we're talking about like poverty being a thing with that state.
that's true. But what did you think about the way that he says, like the motivation for ruining people is, like how he was getting the money, how they're getting the money out of him? Because from what I could tell, it almost sounds like he's describing like predatory lending.
Mm.
Yeah, uh, and I think it was that, but it's also kind of like exploiting people's eagerness to try and like it's almost like, and I think we see like a bit of it now in some of our society too now, about the braggers on social media about like trying to
Mm.
show off how much wealth they've got by just doing dumb stuff with expensive things or something like that. I saw some idiot the other day with a Lamborghini Reventon or something like that, and he's got a pet bear, and the bear was trying to get an apple from inside his Lamborghini, and the bear ripped the door off his Lamborghini. I was like, this is the kind of dumb shit they're talking about. Like, okay, they didn't have fancy Lamborghinis back in his day, but it's the same sort of shit, like dumb, dumb stuff that people do to show off how rich they are. You know, and so I think it's kind
um,
of like finding vices and outlets for people to bask in extravagance and just blow wads of cash. And so people take advantage of this. And go, yeah, sure. You want to do something? Like I'll come up with some crazy crap to take your money.
yeah,
I don't know.
it's
It's a
like
bit of a vibe I get.
well, the way that my book describes it is owing to their power and wealth as they do, they are unwilling to curtail by law the extravagances of youth and prevent them from squandering their money and ruining themselves. For it is by loans to the spendthrifts. It is by such loans that spendthrifts are buying up their property and they hope to increase their own wealth. So essentially, they're happy for people to blow their money like that because it's just ending up in their hands.
100%. We had something similar, not worded exactly the same, but pretty similar.
Yeah.
Yep.
Um, yeah, and it's just saying that basically people of good family or what have you just wind up becoming beggars because they've borrowed too much money and gotten into hock and lost their house or what have you. Um, so I think it's like from looking at that summary, then they start to move on to how that's going to start like triggering some transition. They
Well,
they
he
start
says
looking at like
they too, yeah, but they say he says love of money and adequate self discipline are two things that can't coexist.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
think
I think.
that's correct?
Yeah, I think ours says that there can be no doubt that the love of wealth and the spirit of moderation cannot exist together in citizens of the same state to any considerable extent. One or the other will be disregarded.
Yeah, and look, I think he made that observation back when we are looking at democracy as well, because like he was talking about how the state is divided between people who either have the moderation and are trying to follow the traditional ways, and the others who are more focused on the gaining of wealth and all that sort of thing. Um, so I guess it's kind of a consistent theme he's sort of stuck with.
Yeah,
Um,
and he said that it often reduces men to poverty who are born for better things. So he's kind of like there's a sense that there's a loss of talent because rather than fostering their abilities, you got the youth just giving into extravagances, blowing all their cash and becoming poor. And it's sort of like I can almost see him looking at it going, well, you could have been something great. That could have been a real asset to society, but all you've done is sort of pissed away your youth, kind of thing.
yeah, there was that, and I think also just from the reading that we did like last week on that, they were sort of pointing out the fact that there's no drive for people to do anything, because if they've kind of got money or what have you, they're not putting their efforts into anything because they're already kind of like rich, so they're not playing their real part in society. And those who are on the bottom and trying to work their
Uh,
way up are just so like sort of miserly, just focused on the dollars. Um, that I think their
is that the
society, and this is
ones?
probably,
Is that what he's describing as drones? They're the
uh,
drones.
he was talking about the drones. I think, yeah, being the ones who have like lost money and trying to build themselves back up and are just
Yeah,
watching every penny, the misers, and yeah, he does sort of reference them as drones. Yeah.
Yeah, and
mm.
he's like saying also that they're plotting revolution too, right?
Well, that's
Yeah.
what
We
he's sort
get
of
to that.
leading
Yeah,
to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So by drones, I think he's like is implying bees or wasps, that sort of thing, right? Because later he talks
Yep.
about them having some having stings and some not having stings.
yeah,
Yeah. For sure. Um, yeah. So like with this, he starts talking about the people, which being the drones, um, starting to feel angry, I guess, that they've been taken advantage of and getting sort of crushed by the big guy. So they start to
yeah.
start
So
to
some are in
feel that sort of revolution coming.
yeah, some are in debt and some are disenfranchised, and some of them are both.
Hmm.
And he
Hmm.
well, my book describes them as they become people with hatred in their heart.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think they were saying something along the lines of like, the businessmen that have ruined them will walk past them in the street and like not even acknowledge them. They've taken their money, taken their house or whatever it is, and just kind of step over the bodies or whatever. Um,
Yeah. So did your
and
books
so,
use the term revolution as well?
yep, I'm pretty sure that word was in there. Yep. Um,
See, I think it's interesting. It makes me think of the whole like Marxist socialist thesis.
yeah.
That 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 people are going to eventually get stepped on so bad by the bourgeois, the rich, and the business owners that they're going to want revolution. They're going to redistribute the wealth, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a passage here they talk, and still they remain in the city. Uh, There they are, ready to sting and fully armed, and some of them owe money, some have forfeited their citizenship, and a third class are in both predicaments, and they hate and conspire against those who have got their property and against everybody else and are eager for revolution.
Mm. Yeah.
Mm.
Do you reckon we see any of that now, or is it too abstract?
I don't think we do in Australia right now, um, because I think, in fairness, it's too prosperous.
Mm.
Mm.
Um, it may well be a situation we might find if we end up with a big smashing of like inflation coming through and people being unable to afford mortgages off the back of a recovering economy. You could wind up in that situation. I think, if you, sorry, it probably feels like I'm
Do you
sort of
think?
picking on the US because I kind of picked on them last week a little bit, right? But that's not the case. But I think like the US has a bigger sort of divide between the wealthy, and there's some like real poverty and unemployment in there, and so there may be a bit more of that kind of feeling in the US. I don't know.
Yeah, you're right.
Do you
There's a
think
lot
the
more. There is a lot more people. I mean, that we're more safety netish in Australia. You know.
With healthcare, government provided, and
Yeah.
you know, I think,
But even like from a mental health perspective in Australia, if
sure.
you have a mental illness, you'll be taken to hospital and medicated and looked after until you're good enough to rejoin the community again. I'm
Mm.
not really sure that that's the case in the States, um, and it certainly isn't elsewhere. But I think you could argue you see some of it in Australia with something like I don't know, like when we went to Mudgee recently, I looked at the property prices out there, and I realised I could sell a 3 bedroom house in the suburb I live in and go buy 20 hectares, with a nice place on it. But for someone living in Mudgee to get that level of cash to buy that farm is a really, really big lifelong commitment. Whereas in Sydney, that price for a house is quite low compared to the average. So there is like
Yeah.
this massive discrepancy in pricing for real estate in Sydney compared to the rest of New South Wales. And
New South Wales. Yeah.
I think you know you can even see it in the average wages. If you Google average wage of someone in Sydney and then look at it compared to rural New South Wales, it's substantially higher, and there's no signs of it slowing down. If anything, it's just going to get worse. And so eventually, I think you'll
Yeah.
have this situation where those who want to move into the city or into the greater Sydney area can't afford to, and those who can't afford to stay in Sydney can, for this generation, move out and buy somewhere out in the sticks and be okay. But I think those who stay in Sydney will probably just end up becoming wealthier and wealthier compared to the rural areas. What do you see it sort of playing out that way?
I sort of think it's probably always been that way, but it's just maybe like exacerbated now, just because of I don't know. Maybe it's also because we're just at that age where we're sort of watching it a little bit more closely, right?
Mm.
But I mean, if you think about it, like when our parents bought houses and the inflation that's happened over those years and what the values have sort of changed by, but that's happened in the country as well. I think that in the country, the average wage has always been lower than what it's been in the city. But the cost of living is so much lower that it probably evens out, if you know what I mean. But you're right. If you want to switch from one to the other, there's a cost involved. But it's even the same if you move from state to state. Like different capital cities have got different costs as well. It's something we talk about at work because we've got people working all around the country, and you might have one way that you want to review pay or something, right? And so you have one stance for all your people and sort of say, look, it's going to be an average pay rise of like maybe 2% or something. That's going to vary a little bit between different places. That's maybe based on CPI or whatever else. But depending on where you are, the cost of living is going up in different states compared to others. So I don't know. I tend to think that stuff probably fluctuates all the time anyway. But so I don't know.
I'm kind of sitting here wondering if there's a risk of this kind of thing happening with the way that money seems to have been siphoned off from small businesses over the last 2 years. Hopefully it doesn't get that bad, but I mean, with all the COVID lockdowns, it's the small businesses that had to shut up shop, whereas the big Woolies and the Coles, they kept powering through. So I can only imagine how much money has been siphoned out of the smaller businesses and the middle class to these big companies. Hopefully, it doesn't get that bad, but I mean, you could imagine if that trend continued long term, you would have sort of middle class business owners looking at the big, Westfields, Westfields and what do you call it, Coles and Woolies companies, and just going, you just basically stepped on me. You used the government to shut me down, and now I can't earn a living. So that you could see how that, in comparison to what he's describing, that kind of a situation really could create resentment and disenfranchisement. Hopefully it doesn't, but I can sort of see
But is that more?
that pattern as being a realistic, like it's sort of a realistic scenario at least.
Yeah, no, it could be right there. Could be right.
I think we'll keep going, but I think it's a good question to ask if it's happening, and I'm sure in places in the world it is. What's relative to us in Australia? I don't know. There's definitely parts in here that feel exactly right.
I think there's absolutely a risk of it happening, and we should be eyes wide open about it, for sure.
The other thing I wonder about is, this is like, I know we keep saying this is like a really old book, like it's old, and like obviously Plato and Socrates, they've got this method of describing things and coming to conclusions and describing patterns and stuff. But it seems to me that I wouldn't suggest that they're 100% accurate, but like obviously the economy and world was very different back then in a lot of ways. But I'm just wondering why it is that there seems to be so much similarity despite the eons of time that have passed, and technology is so much different. But these sort of things sort of seem to sort of almost be timeless. I don't know. Have you guys thought about that?
Yeah, I guess it's like people, right? Because it's all sort of people centric stuff. And I don't know, maybe people haven't changed that much. Other stuff has, but I mean, a lot of this is it's about greed or caring for your fellow man and all that sort of thing, rather than sort of the tools to make it happen. So I think maybe that's why it still kind of rings true because it's sort of personality things, I suppose, and
Like
morals and
perhaps human nature hasn't changed or not changed much.
hmm,
Yeah, I think you're
yeah.
right.
I mean, yeah, we're probably not quite so outwardly bloodthirsty, maybe, but most of the other stuff seems to be pretty pretty accurate.
Well, I read this next part and I'm like, hmm. So let's have a read. At present, the governors, induced by the motives which I have named, treat their subjects badly, while they and their adherents, especially the young men of the governing class, are habituated to lead a life of luxury and idleness both of the body and mind. They do nothing and are incapable of resisting either pleasure or pain.
They get soft, basically.
Yeah.
They get soft and they lack self control, discipline, and they can't say no to anything.
You mean like Hunter Biden?
Well, I've actually been a bit slack with that. I'm kind of across it, but not fully. I was thinking more about my own childhood. Um, growing up, I just wanted to play my Sega, listen to music, play basketball. You know, and I was allowed to do it. It's like go do those things. And
Yeah, I suppose that's true because I don't know about you, Lachlan, but I know Tim's parents, I know my parents, and we were by no means rich, but we're a
Yeah.
long way from poor. Like we really
Yeah.
were. We really did have. We wanted for nothing. Put it that way.
yeah,
Yeah. We're pretty well the same. Yeah. Certainly not rich, pretty classic middle class, I suppose. But I don't know. I mean, we had pretty uh, simple things that we enjoyed, though. You know what I mean? So we spent an awful lot of time, just you know, uh, you know, gardening and mucking around in the yard and all that sort of stuff too. Like just sort of, making billy carts and put my rose tinted glasses on. They were great days. So
but I remember getting told over and over again that my childhood was easy and that, and in the moment you don't know that, and as a kid you're like, what are you talking about? Um, but in reflection, like I think my own kid's childhood is even easier than mine, and I think that's happened for 4 generations in a row. Because I recall, like my grandfather, his childhood lived growing up in the country at Tamworth. He'd go bush for a couple of days in a row and hunt rabbits and stuff before he was a teenager, and went off to World War Two. And then my dad, before he finished high school, he was doing boarding school. He was able to shoot a rifle and use a compass and go camping and all that sort of stuff. And then I come along and I didn't shoot any sort of gun until I was a married guy, and even now, like, I'm hopeless with directions. And even with a compass I'd probably get lost, so
yeah,
and my son would be even worse.
I don't know. I guess that stuff's still there. If oh, had a freeze.
Oh yeah, we have a little bit of latency. Try again.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to say, I mean, I think that stuff's still available to you if you want it, right? Or if you want to expose your kids to stuff like that. But it certainly is. I think you're right. Like each generation it is getting easier. Um, I mean, you wouldn't wish a world war on anybody, but I think that's what really sort of shaped the time of our grandparents, and then sort of changed the way they raised their kids, our parents. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because my grandfather was very similar to yours in some sense. There, like yeah, out rabbiting and stuff like that to help put food on the table, or fishing, or whatever it was, and yeah, very simple life. I know my grandmother's family; they grew up quite poor. They were a family of 10, and they had dirt floors in their house. My grandmother told me, like when she was growing up. So yeah, very different times, and that's only a couple of generations. So
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, let's keep having a look. So, where do we want to go from there?
Well, I basically from
yes,
there wrote down that this sort of environment kind of leads to a bit of a disdain for the poor. Basically, there's a little bit section there where it talks about if they go to war together. I couldn't really understand that, but essentially the conclusion is that the richer people come to this conclusion that the poor, they're not much good, and we've got them, and we've kind of got them where we want them.
there's that. Then I think they also had that situation where if the poor man was fighting alongside the rich man who's huffing and puffing and has basically gotten fat off the land. It's never had to fight for anything before because he's just living this life of privilege. That he would look like a soft target, and that if he met him
Yeah,
alone in an alleyway, he could probably do him under and take his purse. You know what I mean? Because he just couldn't even defend himself.
yeah,
Um, but sort of getting at though too is it's just in general, I think like no one cares about any of the virtues. So when we sort of go back to thinking about what that ideal state is and how far it's decayed to get down to this point, like just no one cares about them anymore. So they're either
mm,
distracted by wealth or the trappings of it, or have gotten so poor and desperate that they're going to do whatever they can to get back to the top again. Um, so yeah, basically, I think they're sort of saying that like the guardians of the state, which are this rich class, would just not be able to defend the state at all, really, because they've let themselves go so much.
yeah. That's
Um,
right. And then so they then basically come to the conclusion that democracy originates when the poor win and they kill or exile their opponents, um,
Yep.
and give the rest equal rights and opportunities of office. So basically, they take away the power from these rich oligarchs and sort of take the power back, I guess you could say.
But then distribute it really badly.
Well, is that what he says somewhere?
That's kind of what it says. I'm just trying to
Yeah.
find it. Da, da, da.
But they're basically saying that this is how democracy becomes established because all the poor, there's so many of them, and they basically rise up against the rich and just go, nah, enough's enough.
well, he sort of used it, I suppose, a little example too, and he talks about sort of sickness, and so he
Yeah, that's a
talks
good little
about
bit.
that it's like a disease within the body, and saying like when you're not looking after yourself, the body becomes diseased, and it's saying it's the same with this state. So you've got these um, it's like an illness within there, and that the state's trying to sort of almost like purge itself of that illness, which is to take it back over.
Mm.
So the state falls sick and is at war with itself, I think is the way that he sort of puts it. um, and so that's how sort of democracy sort of wangles its way in there to try and restore some balance.
Yeah. So the part I was talking about, sorry, Ruben, was it's not quite how I said it, but he says so. And then democracy comes into being after the poor have conquered their opponents, slaughtering some and banishing some, while to the remainder they give an equal share of freedom and power, and this is the form of government in which the magistrates are commonly elected by lot. Yes, he said, that is the nature of democracy, whether the revolution has been effected by arms, or whether fear has caused the opposite party to withdraw.
Oh, right. Yeah, no, but I think there actually was. I'm not 100% sure about this. Don't go quoting me, but I think there was actually a time in history where they did select their leaders by, yeah, basically by lot, or by rolling a dice essentially, or drawing straws.
Yeah.
I don't know how well that worked or how long that lasted, but
Is
that
that
was
what
a thing at
is
some.
that what they're saying there, or is it?
Yeah, that's what or I don't know. I think that's what they're referring to. That
I thought they would talk about voting though, but
That's what I
maybe I'm
thought.
wrong.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
thought.
I'd actually
Yeah.
I don't think that. Well, I don't think they are, but only because I've sort of heard that there were times when that's exactly how they selected rulers, just
You
basically
might
by
be
lot.
right because they're talking about it because if you think about it, if there was voting there, then they'd get through that whole process of trying to influence, the votes. And the whole point of the way they describe this version of democracy is this absolute fairness in the way that they do
Yeah,
Yep.
things. Um,
yeah.
so you might be,
I
might be
guess
right there.
the other way to look at it would be, even if there were a vote, you've got so much variety amongst the people, it'd be almost akin to just rolling a dice anyway. But I don't think that's what it means. I do think they're actually talking about a literal lot.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like you're talking about the variety there, because this is something that he really seems to labour the point of. Is the fact that in democracy, it encourages, I guess, like great diversity of the people,
Yeah,
and that there are people coming from all different sort of walks of life, maybe different regions, and they're all bringing different philosophies and customs together. And he's saying, that when they're, you know, looking at like making a constitution, they're going to look at it almost like it's a menu. Because they've got so
yeah.
many different customs and backgrounds, it's like just selecting the favorites off there, to try and sort of come up with a constitution. So it's almost like he sort of admires it, but at the same time, I think he sees it that there's no strength there because they're so ununified. Um, it's quite funny the way he puts it. It's kind of like it's a bad thing and a good thing.
Yeah, you're right. He says, well, they basically say, well, what kind of a state would this be? And that's what he's describing there. He's like saying, yeah, it would be very free and very
Mm.
diverse.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Yeah, it's men of every different personality, style, and custom sort of all coming together. Um, it's funny, like they sort of saying like it's almost like, isn't it quaint? Like it's like charming. I don't quite know. It's kind of like it's a cute idea. I don't know that you'd really want to do it, but it's a cute idea. It's a very funny way of kind of putting it. I don't know if maybe I'm feeling a bit defensive of poor old democracy, but I feel like they're taking the piss of it a bit.
Well, but this, I'll read a passage. I think it captures what you're saying. It says, "This
Yeah,
then seems likely to be the fairest of states, being an embroidered robe which is spangled with every sort of flower. And just
yeah,
as women and children think a variety of colours to be of all things most charming, so there are many men to whom this state, which is spangled with the manners and characters of mankind, will appear to be the fairest of states."
Yeah, so
yeah,
my reading of that bit was essentially what he's saying is that democracy is the most attractive um, government because of, or society, because of all the variety and all the color and all the excitement.
yeah,
But my reading of that is saying, yes, it's attractive, but it's a
yeah,
superficial attractiveness. Because my book actually inverts what you just said, and
yeah,
it basically says, perhaps most people would find it for this reason, judge it to be the best form of society, like women and children when they see gaily coloured things.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the way that mine's translated, it's got a little bit more an air of condescension kind of thing. It's like
I, I was
it's
picking
beautiful,
up
it's
anyway.
pretty,
Yeah,
it's kind of it's exciting if you're 5. That's sort of what
yeah.
it's saying.
But he also says straight after that, there will be no better place in which to look for a government. And it's like, why?
I
And you
think they're
go,
saying that though
That's
because there's such variety.
that's
of
right, yeah. So he's saying
backgrounds,
you might accidentally find it there.
Yeah, okay. You're. Oh, you mean? Oh, my read on it was like if you're going to set up a government, go there and have a look. But you're right. They might find just pure by fluke, and by good like lucky voting or lot casting, they might end up with a good government. Is that the way you
Yeah,
saw it?
well, listen to this. So it says, because of the liberty which reigns there, they have a complete assortment of constitutions, and he who has a mind to establish a state, as we have been doing, must go to a democracy as he would to a bazaar at which they sell them, and pick out the one that suits him. Then, when he has made his choice, he may have found his state. So he's like,
Yeah.
if you're going to find what we're talking about, we'll find it in a democracy.
But then he does go on to say though that you might find it there, but you're kind of wasting your time because no one gives a shit.
Yeah, because everyone's like, well, you can't tell me what to do.
Well, that's
Yeah,
true, and that's because he does. He goes on to say, in this society, if there's a war, you can fight if you want, but if you don't want to, you don't. And if you want to lead, you can lead, but if you don't want to, you don't.
Yeah, it's that absolute freedom, and that seems to be, I think, maybe one of the things he's sort of picking at being its downfall there, because he's
Yeah,
saying like basically nobody cares, and you need people to care at least a little bit, and he's sort of
yeah,
implying everyone just kind of just does what they want. And they don't like, if you're not bothering me, I'm not going to bother you, which is great. It's kind of like a nice neighborly thing to do, but sometimes maybe if there's something bad happening, you really should care and you should do something about it to protect your state and or protect your neighbor or wherever it may well be.
yeah. He says it's a wonderfully pleasant way to carry on in the short term, in the short run, perhaps. So they're both sort of saying it sounds nice, it looks, and it might be nice for a little bit, but the implication there is long term, it's not sustainable.
Yeah.
I think if you've got it in the way that they describe it, I don't know. I don't think we experience democracy in the way that he's necessarily painting there.
Correct.
But in the example he paints, you can understand where he's getting at. But
so let's move on to the manner of the man, of the individual, of the democracy. I might just read a little bit and then.
Yeah, go.
Okay. Consider now, I said, what manner of man the individual is, or rather consider, as in the case of the state, how he comes into being. Very good, he said. Is not this the way? He is the son of the miserly and oligarchical father who has trained him in his own habits? Exactly. And, like his father, he keeps under by force the pleasures of which are of the spending, and not of the getting sort, because those which are called unnecessary? Obviously. Would you like, for the sake of clearness, to distinguish which are the necessary and which are the unnecessary pleasures? I should. Tangent alert. Tangent alert.
It's a short one.
Yeah.
It's a short tangent, but you're right.
Here we go again.
Does love a tangent.
It's like walking through a farm field, having a conversation, and every time they see a rabbit burrow, they just dive into it. Left and right. So, has anyone got a quick summary of the necessary and unnecessary?
Well, look, they use food as an example, right? And saying, say, like, the necessary be something that gives satisfaction, that's an benefit to you, and you can't get rid of it. You need this thing. And that it might be in your nature to desire what's beneficial and necessary for you. So they're talking about food being something that's necessary, which is like simple food, we should say, that's going to give you sustenance and strength. So, so it does you good and it's necessary for life. So that would be considered to be, a necessary pleasure. And then they talk about unnecessary pleasures, which are something you don't have to have, and it doesn't necessarily do good, or it may in fact do bad. So it might be something where, like if we stuck to food for the example, it might be that like really rich, deluxe food that you're having and such, and we could use the example that maybe it's full of fat and salt and all this stuff that tastes good and it's super tasty, but it's actually not good for you. So you don't really need it. It's just something that you want, and maybe it's actually doing yourself some harm.
Yeah, he says there's the unnecessary are desires that can be got rid of with practice. So, but I think as
Yeah.
you're saying, there is if you're disciplined, you can avoid those things.
Resist
Whereas
the temptation.
obviously, yeah, whereas the desire for food, you can't avoid it because if you don't eat, you die.
Yep. I think that's it.
Yeah. Okay. So it's quite long-winded, this part, but I mean, where do we want to jump in? So basically, we've got. So now they've done this little sidetrack thing. So again, let us see how the democratical man grows out of the oligarchical. The following, as I suspect, is commonly the process. What is the process? When a young man who has been brought up, as we were just now describing, in a vulgar and miserly way, has tasted drone's honey and has come to associate with fierce and crafty natures who are able to provide for him all sorts of refinements and varieties of pleasure, then, as you may imagine, the change will begin of the oligarchical principle within him to the democratical, inevitably. And as in the city, like was helping like, and the change was effected by an alliance from without assisting one division of the citizens, so too the young man is changed by a class of desires coming from without to assist the desires within him, that which is and alike again, helping that which is akin and alike, certainly. And if there be any ally which aids the oligarchical principle within him, whether the influence of a father or of kindred, advising or rebuking him, then there arises in his soul a faction and an opposite faction, and he goes to war with himself. It must be so.
I think he's basically describing somebody who struggles between their desires, essentially, isn't he? He's like saying that their desires start to control him.
Yeah, I think he's definitely sort of giving in, but at the same time, he's like not sure if he should or shouldn't, and so he's just arguing within himself around whether he should sort of give in to that temptation or not. And he's got all these other people in there trying to pressure him as well to sort of partake and to just be part of their society that's in these vulgar ways, as Socrates puts it.
Yeah. Sorry, I forgot what I was going to say. You go.
Oh yeah, and there's so many descriptive parts here that talk about what happens when it goes south. Like there's this part here that says, then modesty, which they call silliness, is ignominiously thrust into exile by them, and temperance, which they nickname unmanliness, is trampled in the mire and cast forth. They persuade men that moderation and orderly expenditure are vulgarity and meanness, and so by the help of a rabble of evil appetites, they drive them beyond the border. There's a similar flavour a little bit further down where he says, and when they've emptied and swept clean the soul of him who is now in their power and who is being initiated by them in great mysteries, the next thing is to bring back to their house insolence and anarchy and waste and impudence in bright array, having garlands on their heads and a great company with them, hymning their praises and calling them by sweet names. Insolence they term breeding, and anarchy liberty, and waste magnificence, and impudence courage. And so the young man passes out of his original nature, which was trained in the school of necessity into the freedom and libertinism of useless and unnecessary pleasures.
Yeah, so this is
I
the transformation from the miserly upbringing to the full oligarchical. What did we call him? The spendthrift, right? So you're
Yeah.
sort of having that transition going from one to the other. So they talk about you've had the drones,
basically
honey. You've had
miserly.
that.
Sorry,
There
Rick.
you go.
Basically, miserly means money and wealth focused,
Frugal.
stingy kind of. Yeah, frugal,
Yep.
and then spendthrift means you spend your money willy nilly.
Yeah.
I don't think it's supposed to mean generous. I think it's essentially supposed to mean just you know spend money in a crazy way, like buying a Lamborghini and putting a bear in it.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah, because I think when they talk about the miserly father, it's like he's so focused on gaining wealth that he won't give in to any of those um, unnecessary pleasures. Right? He's purely focused on the absolutely necessary and will not spend money on anything. Right? But he's
Mm.
taken all the sweetness out of his life because he's so bitter because he's just focused on just amassing wealth and just getting by. Um, that he lives this really dark kind of life.
Mm.
And then on the flip side, you've got the spendthrifts who are like the complete opposite and are just like spending that cash and having a great old time getting
Right.
into everything they can, but maybe winding up broke and ending back becoming a drone again as a miser because they've wrecked their life by blowing all their cash.
I think
Um,
the idea there is the kids, the child of the miser, like they grow up, their dad's stingy and doesn't really indulge in anything. So it's kind of like they see that, and then they see because they're misers, they're rich, they got a lot of money, and then they see all these people out in
yeah.
societies with all this money, and they're like, "What are you doing with all this money? You're just hoarding it." And then so they kind of get this idea to go and spend, and then they get influenced to do that.
Hmm.
That section that you read, Tim, I liked. My translation actually made a bit more sense to me. So basically, what they're doing is comparing all these different things. So they call shame silliness. So
Hmm.
whereas the miser or the person who's a little bit more careful with their money would call um, something shameful, they go, "Oh no, that's not shame. That's silliness." And they call self-control cowardice. So it's kind of like you can imagine two groups, a group of kids just turn 18, they go to the pub, and one of them's a bit careful with his money. He's like, "Oh no, I'll just get one beer because I want to keep my money for something else." And his mate's going, "Don't be a pussy, have another beer. Don't be a wuss.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. It's just
Yeah.
money." It's that kind of
Yeah.
dynamic, I think. Um, and then
Yeah.
later on, they call extravagance, so they become insolent, extravagant, and shameless, basically.
Hmm.
They call insolence good breeding, license liberty, and extravagance generosity,
And do you think you ever
and
see this
and
out of like
shamelessness courage.
do you think you see this behavior in like kids of rich people sometimes? Like
Yeah,
they've sort
Oh
of
yeah.
grown up wanting nothing and I don't know, just having unlimited funds at their disposal without really having to, I don't know, work for it or whatever.
well, the one that occurred to me is that my book says they call shamelessness courage. So what I thought of
Mm,
there is like these days you see some like imagine a couple of kids getting on the drink, and taking their clothes off and doing a nudie run.
mm,
Like you might call that shameless, but they go, no, 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 that was brave because he got naked and ran through the park. Whereas
yeah.
somebody who's sober, and a little bit older, would be just like, you're an idiot. But they call it courage,
Yeah.
that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm, mm. But yeah, and I think it's interesting. They sort of when they're talking through this stuff too, they talk about the fact that he's sort of battling this idea in his head. And I think they call back to his father as well, saying that his father had kind of call him out on the behaviour and try and bring him back into line. But he'd go into the this is a term is another terminology I liked joining the lotus eaters. So
Oh, did
Yes.
you look it up?
yeah, I did. So it's a person who spends time indulging in pleasure and luxury rather than dealing with practical concerns is a lotus eater.
There you go.
But yeah, more or less, his peers are going to be trying to, encourage that bad behavior, ridicule temperance and as unmanliness and all those other virtues, and try and convert him from the miser to the spendthrift, seeking luxury and pleasure.
But then they go into, maybe even if he starts to come good again, he can't come fully good. And I enjoyed reading this part because it was kind of hopeful, but then it wasn't. But I'll just read this bit. After he lives on, spending his money and labour and time on unnecessary pleasures, quite as much as on necessary ones. But if he be fortunate and is not too much disordered in his wits, when years have elapsed and the heyday of passion is over, supposing that he then readmits into the city some part of the exiled virtues, and does not wholly give himself up to the successes, in that case he balances his pleasures and lives in a sort of equilibrium, putting the government of himself into the hands of the one which comes first and wins the turn, and when he has had enough of that, then into the hands of another. He despises none of them, but encourages them all equally. Very true.
Is that saying basically that he comes basically the way that he achieves balance is just giving into each of his desires, but just giving to them in turn? So, today I might drink a little bit too much, but then tomorrow I'll make up for it by exercising or something. I think actually goes on to say that, something to that effect, doesn't he?
He does. Yeah, he says he'll be drinking wine one day, then having nothing but water the next, or something like that.
Yeah, and he refers to it in my book as an equality of desires. So it's kind of contrasting that against the society where they had this whole idea about freedom and equality and everyone's equal. And he's kind of saying, well, in the individual, what that translates into is giving your desires equal footing.
So I want to share something quite personal here. I wrote "oops" in this paragraph. Right. So because I'm going to be, I'll read this and I'll explain slightly. So, yes, I said, he lives from day to day, indulging the appetite of the hour, and sometimes he is lapped in drink and strains of the flute. Then he becomes a water drinker and tries to get thin. Then he takes a turn at gymnastics, sometimes idling and neglecting everything, then once more living the life of a philosopher. Often he is busy with politics and starts to his feet and says and does whatever comes into his head. And if he is emulous of anyone who is a warrior, off he is in that direction, or of men of business, once more in that. His life has neither law nor order, and this distracted existence he terms joy and bliss and freedom, and so he goes on. Some of those things, I was like, oh, come on. It was very familiar.
I knew you were going to call this one out, because I thought the same, Tim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm like, particularly the whole then becomes a water drinker and tries to get thin. I'm reading that 3 weeks into a 12-week weight loss challenge. I'm like, stuff you, Socrates.
Stop telling me who I am.
I know, it was weird. It was really weird reading that. And you can see from this smorgasbord of distractions I have behind me that I'm easily distracted. And you guys know me really well. I've got musical instruments up here.
Yeah.
I've got old cars. I've done many different jobs. I just felt like when I read that paragraph, I was like, holy crap, am I like a true democratic man?
Giving in to the whims of your mind.
It was weird. What thoughts, Ruben? Judge me.
No, 100%. That's pretty much a good description. But I have to say that I thought the exact same thing.
Oh, cool.
Particularly where he's like, and next indolence and careless at ease, and then a period of philosophic study. I find myself doing that. Like I'll hook right into something, and I'm like, oh, this is really important. This is really interesting. And then a week later, I'm like, oh, who gives a crap? And you do sort of go through phases, and I'm in the same boat as you in terms of fitness. Like I'll go through phases where months on end, like that's my focus. I'm like, I'm going to get in shape. I'm going to get in shape. And then 6 months later, you look back and you go, if only I had kept that up.
Yeah. How did you feel reading that part, Lachlan?
Look, very much the same. Yeah, because I know, like you'd mentioned it. You didn't mention the passage. You just said that you'd read something in there that you just sort of thought, "Dang, that's me." And when I read it, I was like, "Yeah, that's the passage," because I feel the same.
So you reckon Socrates has nailed us down?
Well, in that sense, but I mean, he says it like it's kind of a bad thing, though, right?
Isn't it?
Well, I don't know. I think I think it's bad in the okay, maybe that passage isn't a bad thing, right? But it's I think more sort of like backtracking just a little bit, where he's talking about the fact that you kind of like your virtues, you would like give in to them as a whim, if you know what I mean. So it's saying that maybe somebody who's from a democratic background or democratic government, or you're the democratic man, that you would not have a set of values for yourself in the way that you would operate. And I don't know that that's an accurate portrayal. It's probably true for many people who exist in a democratic government, right? But I don't think it's true for everybody.
Well,
Yeah.
And
I think you're
I
right. I
suppose
think
that's
it's an
what I
accurate
sort of drew issue
description.
with. Mm.
But I think I actually hadn't thought of that, but I think you're right. But what I thought essentially where his objection comes from is you got to remember his whole idea of the ideal state and the ideal man is you got one thing and you do it well. Unity. He's always like
Mm.
unity, unity, unity. The state's got to be unified. It's all got to work together. If you have a profession, you do that one thing because if you do that one thing, you'll do it well. So this is like basically the tail end, the far opposite, which is I think why, as I said at the start of our discussion, I think that's why it's second rung. Like it's like right down the bottom. Because for him,
Yeah,
it's like it just represents it represents being so far from any kind of unity and what he would call justice.
So I don't understand his reasoning for that, and I'll see if I can explain it well enough. He's my understanding of his pursuit is a pursuit for truth, right, or knowledge.
Mm.
So, I mean, when we were talking the other week about how the math that they refer to in here as being specialised as stuff that we teach in primary school now. If he was time machined, first of all, I would choose a DeLorean. But if he was time machined to right now, would he have the same opinion? Because the width of speciality is so much broader now. I mean, guys who are eye surgeons focus only on the eye. But he would say, well, they're a doctor. Would he, when he's talked about in the past, would he have gone, if you study medicine, you should do medicine? Were there specialists back then? Were there guys that focused on just fixing legs? Know what I mean? Is it possible to be so focused in our current society with everything being so dynamic and so many different specializations within each field? I've even noticed some of the best specialists who, or let's talk like Brian Cox for a minute. Like he's a very knowledgeable scientist in his field, but he still looks in other fields. It still investigates them because it complements his science. So that would be my argument to Socrates. Is like you can't be a specialist and know and be the master of it, because without knowing the things surrounding it, you have an incomplete understanding of that thing.
Mm.
Does that make sense? So the punchline is, like, do you think he would still think that way if you could present the wealth of knowledge and types of industries and job types that we currently have? Do you think that he couldn't perceive what we have now being a reality? It was sort of more just your blacksmith works with metal, a carpenter works with timber, a doctor works with bodies, It was just that simple level. Whereas now it's like a metal worker doesn't do everything with metal. A metal worker might only do construction steel, or might do automotive construction or robotics. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, look, I guess you're right. Like the times were different back then, and that the number of roles that you could perform in a society is much more limited. And I guess because of that, you knew you needed a certain number of people to do certain tasks in order to have a functioning society. Because we're working on something like globalization now, that makes it quite different. And I think
Mm.
if he was looking at it, us sort of pre-globalization, he'd probably still maybe stick to his statement. But in a post-globalized world, it'd probably sort of have to retract that a little bit and say, okay, there's sufficient people in the world to do sufficient tasks, and so maybe that's not such an issue now. I don't know.
I think that's right. I think you're right, Lachlan. We because we're living post industrial revolution and post automation. Like you
Mm,
can now have two or three people work a farm that can feed, you know, thousands of people. Back
Yeah.
then, you would probably need 100 people to work that same farm. So that leaves a lot of surplus labor without any work. So what do all those people do? And that's what we see now. That's why we have an explosion of entertainment. That's why we have an explosion of we're a consumer culture now rather than a producing culture. We have the luxury to do that because we can so easily produce things, or we have
mm,
other countries that can so easily produce things for us.
Yeah.
I think that's the fundamental difference between the world he lived in and the one we do.
mm,
But I think your description with, I think science in particular would be something where I think he'd stick to his guns because he'd be like, yeah, well, my point still stands because things are, you have to know a lot more, and things are a lot more, like knowledge is a lot more specified. So I think he would probably look at that and say, well, that's an example of what I'm talking about. If you want
Mm.
to be a really good physicist, you can't spend half your time on biology and half your time on physics.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fair point.
But but I just want to rewind a little bit because I think we glossed over a point that Lachlan brought up, which I thought was, I think, a good critique. Lachlan, you were saying that you can have all these different interests and you can go and do all these different things, but that doesn't disqualify you from having an overarching set of principles.
mm.
Socrates is basically saying if this is your temperament, then you're going to just float with the wind and go wherever your desires bring you. But I think
Yeah.
you can see with society today, you can have all these different interests and try all these different things. But that doesn't disqualify you from having an overarching set of principles. So I think I'd agree with you
No,
there.
yeah. Look, I think that's in the individual. If you're looking at the state which he's describing, I could maybe understand that argument because what he's saying is because you've come from so many different backgrounds and so many different personalities and all this sort of thing that you don't have a unified set of
Yeah,
principles or values, and that your state is dysfunctional because there aren't common values for your state.
yeah, and he's
Um,
not talking about a democracy as we know it. We talk about, I mean, we live in democracies, but they're not democracies, not pure democracies. We have constitutional governments and all that sort of stuff, and we have voting within it, so we call it a democracy. But it's not democracy like he's talking about. He's talking about a pure democracy, even to the
yeah.
point where they select leaders by casting lots, by rolling
Yeah.
dice, basically. He's like, so
Yeah.
that's a different proposition to what we're talking about. So yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
Like if that was the reality of the society you lived in, yeah, you couldn't really have an overarching principle.
No. Look, I mean, it's in fairness, I think it's something it's worth sort of looking at and understanding because, I mean, you can question what your own society's set of values are too, and I think it's an interesting time because we are sort of in a more globalized environment with a lot of people from different backgrounds, different religions, different philosophies, and it's actually kind of an interesting thing to think about in this modern era because you know I think you probably could have looked at a country like Australia and sort of said, I think I know what the values are. But now that, we're such a broad multicultural society, you probably have to reevaluate what they are now, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's a bit
And I'd say
odd.
that's probably true for a lot of countries now as well, because it's it's just a global environment rather than such a specific country focus. I mean, each country's still got its flavour. Australia certainly has its sort of style. Do we have unified values for how all Australians feel about how we should live our life? I'd say there'd be some that we'd agree on, and then there'd be some others that would probably be pretty hotly contested these days.
Yeah. Well, I think we should move on to introducing tyranny, but we'll cover tyranny in next week's episode because I'm just conscious of time. But
yeah, I think we I reckon we just mention tyranny and maybe wrap it up, and I think maybe next week we can cover tyranny and the tyrannical character somehow.
Yeah.
We should point out the book 8 doesn't quite go through the tyrannical character anyway, so it strolls into book 9 via another diversion. So
another rabbit hole.
Another rabbit hole. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I reckon just in wrapping up thoughts, I think I actually think we nailed it in terms of the fact that when he's talking about a democracy, he's not talking about the kind of democracy you're talking about. But when I think he describes that democratic character or the kind of person that is produced in that democratic style society, I think he nails it. I think he's pretty much spot on. What do you guys reckon?
I think so. I'm really curious, actually, to understand. I'm always keen to try and do a little bit of digging, as I do every now and then, just to have a look at a democratic society in ancient Greece. So I want to see if that's how it did function, because I think he's pulling this from an example, right? And so I'm just curious to see if they really did have a society that functioned like that, and how did it work.
Yeah, it worked. Yeah, that'd be interesting. I do think he. I do think his negativity towards it is the fact that he really sees unity as being that real principle to aim for, and that you have a role, and then fulfilling that role is what gives you purpose. And then he sees this kind of living, and he's like, I think he doesn't say it, but my interpretation of it is he sees it as an absence of purpose, because you're not fulfilling a purpose or a role, so you're kind of just floating around like a leaf in the wind.
I agree, and I guess he's also trying to pull it together with that noble lie in his perfect state as well, around that overarching sort of philosophy for the people as well. So I think with everything that he wants the absolute unity on every level. We are all fighting towards the exact same thing. There is no discrepancy in our understanding, and wherever you've got that sort of misunderstanding or diversion, he just sees it as a fault. So
well, and then that's a good little intro to tyranny. Something goes wrong from democracy, but we'll look into that next week, I reckon, and hopefully that'll carry us midway into chapter 9. So just before we sign off, let's head on down to our favourite location. Absolutely. Pub for lots of us. And the glass is empty. Sad.
I think I could almost go with G&T now.
Yeah, it's getting later.
It'd be nice, but it's an unnecessary desire, mate.
Oh, you're so right.
Well, if you mix unnecessary with necessary equally, that means you would have 50% ice and 50% gin. So that works.
I don't know whether Socrates would say your math is on the money there. It's just that.
Yeah, no, I think he would disagree. That was a good convo, guys. I thank you for opening up about the democracy part a little bit. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that since I read it, because I accidentally read ahead, as you know, last week, and I've been thinking about this whole simple life thing, and as I've pointed out, I've got many things which I've accrued over the years, and I'm kind of considering thinning it out a bit as a result of thinking this through. Have you guys had any similar thoughts? Have you sort of assessed, have you got too much stuff or you do too many things while you've been chewing on Socrates' whole simple life is what a good answer sort of thing?
I have to say, I think about that stuff a bit anyway. Like before this book, or before this chapter. Um, yeah, stuff bothers me a bit, and I don't know. I think that's something from my mum's side of the family or something like that. But I don't know. Too much stuff, too much clutter. Yeah, it. I don't deal with it so well. My wife's side of the family, though, they got loads of stuff. They like keeping everything. So you get a bit of yin with the yang. But yeah, no, like I think you can't take this stuff with you, right? So if you're getting enjoyment from it, though, I don't see a problem with it as long as it's not running your life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think you see people who, like, particularly like sort of collectors, get it sort of obsessed with stuff, and as long as I think stuff is the I don't know, the sprinkles on top of the cupcake, and it's not the cupcake, then I think you're all right.
Oh, there's an
Good
analogy. Nice.
Yeah.
How about you, Rubes?
Yeah, a couple of things. I do sort of that description did sort of strike me a bit too, and it made me sort of think about my own life. And I do think I've suffered from a lack of discipline. Um, I mean, self-discipline. So I think, particularly when he talks about temperance, I sort of think, well, I think I could have benefited from that. Like, particularly when you talk about exercise, like, what if I was more disciplined with that and I just did do it and continue it? I'd probably be in a much better and healthier position than I am now, rather than sort of intermittently doing it for a couple of months a year and a couple of months off. So, I mean, how you actually foster that in yourself at our age, I don't know, but I think it's something that could be benefit of. And the other thing that I noticed too is when he's talking about sort of just indulging those unnecessary desires, I think about the amount of time that I've probably wasted over the years just watching movies and TV and video games. Like, I'm not saying those are bad things, but I mean, if you spend, I don't know, let's just say hypothetically speaking, you spent half a day playing a video game, you get to the end of the day, if you honestly look back at it, it's like, well, that might have been fun, but think about all the other things I could have achieved in that time. I think he's got a fair point about, exercising some self-discipline in that aspect as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have.
But you don't want to become
thoughts
the miser
sometimes.
and not do any of it, though.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's got to be a balance in there somewhere. Like you that sprinkles. You want that fun stuff to be the sprinkles, not the cupcake.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. I mean, Lachlan, you and I both have toy cars. One of the things I realised a while ago was I love including my kids with that at the moment. So that's why I love having a 4-seat old car, because they can jump in there with me and we drive around.
Yep. Yeah.
So I think that's a good compromise in that that's still self-indulging, but it's also giving joy to other people I care about and creating a memory for all of us to reflect on and enjoy, which is a bit different to me just sort of sitting in my man cave by myself on VR or something. At least they're involved and it's an experience thing. So
maybe that's the answer, mate.
Yeah.
Experiences shared are experiences doubled or something.
Well, I think experience is always better than stuff. You know what I mean? If you can use stuff to have an experience, that's cool. But
I feel like that's the sweet spot.
Yeah.
And sharing it with people that are important.
Yeah. Well, let's wrap it up there. That feels like a nice place to wrap it up. A bit of a long one tonight, but complicated idea and quite a personal one. So For those of you listening, thanks for joining us. We will, well, in theory, we'll be back next week to keep it working our way through. We're getting close to Christmas. We will be having a break over that period at some point in time. I'm kind of hopeful that we could have finished the book about 2 months ago, but I'm like, I don't think we're going to finish before Christmas.
Yeah, we just spent a whole night on a quarter of a chapter, so
Yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully they're
Yeah,
not
we're
personal.
slowing down, not speeding up. Yeah.
I know there's something weird going on. We might
we
have
did
to
so well last week.
Yeah, we might have to do a 2-part special to catch up or something. But, when we do catch up face to face as well, I have a surprise for you guys. Compliments of my dear old mum.
Interesting.
So,
I'm intrigued.
Very mysterious. But when we catch up face to face, I shall reveal this to the world, what the surprise was.
Okay.
I think you guys will like it.
All right.
All right, to everyone, thanks for listening. And remember, the Republic wasn't built in a day, and not a middle-aged man.